But we wanted to, start off with some really, a really important story that has not been getting enough coverage nationally and even regionally, which is the continued crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, where folks, as everyone remembers, across the South, were really struggling with this horrible winter storm that obviously hit Texas and left millions of people without power and freezing cold temperatures for over a week. Well, people in Jackson, Mississippi have not had running water since that storm. Now, water has been restored for some areas, but even the areas that it has been restored in, many of those areas, people aren't able to drink or use the water that they have without boiling it. People have been boiling water from bathtubs that still had snow in them from the storm. Right. I just want people to understand that not only is this a severe crisis in the extent that people don't have water, but that it has been a prolonged crisis. So, the National Guard has been out providing people with non-potable water, potable water, and they still have to turn people away because of the high demand, even for water that people can't use without boiling first. And while services are being restored, many are still waiting. And for people who are getting those services restored, it's trickling in and they're not able to use their water again. These factors are compounding because of an environmental crisis and this water crisis that is now turning into an economic crisis because people, especially in a city like Jackson, which has a large amount of the population, around 25% of the population who are living in poverty. And again, remember, we're using US government statistics for what poverty means, which are just ridiculously inadequate for measuring people's day-to-day experience. So you're having this, environmental crisis and water crisis falling onto an economic crisis that was already there before. But now people who are already living in difficult circumstances because of COVID and because of capitalism are now facing, higher bills and the fact that they haven't been able to work for the past couple of weeks because they can't go into work or their job has been closed because their job doesn't have access to running water, right? And there's been a lot of takes about what's going on in Jackson, right? And I just want to highlight a couple things that are abundantly clear. There's no doubt about it that the state government and the Republican run state government has refused to invest in the city of Jackson, Mississippi for a long, long, long time, right? That is criminal. There is no doubt about that. But we are also talking about a city that is operating on a water system that is over 100 years old. A water system, Jackson ain't a big city, but it's a city that was only around 20,000 people when the system was constructed and is now around 180,000 people, right? If it was just a question of population increases, that would be one thing, but this is a system that just has not had the kind of investment and maintenance that is needed. But what we are seeing in Flint, in Texas, in Mississippi, and coming to cities like Washington, D.C. and Brooklyn, New York, is that the lack of investment in this critical infrastructure is going to have serious consequences for people. And the lack of investment, we can, pinpoint a lot of different factors as to why. But the primary one is that we live in a system, capitalism, that makes a decision that it wants to protect the benefits and the privileges of the few and the wealthy over investing in the public, right? Why are city governments across the country not able to provide and maintain their services, right? Because city governments are under incredible amounts of pressure to slash budgets so that wealthy people in those cities don't have to face higher rates of taxation, right? And people who are in politics have a very short-term view of what they need to do, right? Because they're just thinking about, their next election. They're not willing to make, the significant investments that will prevent a crisis 20 years down the line. So when we see these things, yes, they are examples of systemic racism. They are examples of climate catastrophe, all of these, words that people are throwing around now, but they are fundamentally crises of capitalism and crises of democracy that bleed out of those. We will only see these crises get worse in the coming years. The only way that we can push back against them is to start being very concrete in what we are talking about. And in these instances, we are talking about infrastructure that has been destroyed through decades of neoliberalism and then capitalism, systems that do not put people first, systems that do not democratize, systems that are constantly searching to provide the best climate for profit making and rent seeking, and not for building communities and systems that are looking out for all people. So this is a great example of why we need a Green New Deal. And what I mean by that is not just a commitment to fighting climate change, which obviously we need, but focusing too on the New Deal aspect of that, which is taking the crumbling infrastructure in this country and encouraging people and helping people work and find jobs in replacing and renovating our crumbling infrastructure. Because all across the country, and in particularly in water, these systems are at a crisis point, and decades of austerity and slashed budgets have only made it much worse.
Yeah, it really is amazing how much of our infrastructure was put in place at that time, like around the New Deal, when capitalism was most afraid. And it's
Mm-hmm.
obviously not a coincidence. So that was the lesson that, you know, people try to drive home about Flint, is that this is not just uniquely Flint, and this is not. I mean, this is American. This is an American capitalism problem.
And the point is not to like put any of these politicians off the hook. It's to make the point that these are certainly policy decisions, but the climate that they come out of are problems of capitalism, right? Because you look at Flint had massive speculation and private interests getting involved in their water systems, right? People and organizations who their number one goal is to cut and make sure that they're doing everything as cheaply as possible, which means you're going to get a cheaper and worse off project. And when we're talking about things like a basic human necessity like water, that is not a system that you want in the hands of people whose primary motivation are cutting budgets or profit seeking.
Yeah, I mean, it's very depressing. The how remember like the first time I heard about Nestle and the water
Mm,
supply, and you think about like children of men type scenarios that are going to happen when you're older, and no, it's like this is just the world we live in, and is it going to affect people you love, or are you going to be lucky enough to avoid it? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'm just saying, like, I remember when I was living in Washington, D.C., and reading reports about the water system there, where the people who were managing it were saying, we have about 25 years left on this system, or not only will people face shortages, this entire shed underneath the city, our source of water for Washington, D.C., will become so contaminated that we can't use it anymore, right? And sitting there and realizing it's like, there really aren't people at the top who are taking this into consideration. Like, I'm sure they're aware of it, right? But they are making that kind of ridiculous and devastating and damaging political calculus to not address it. In Mississippi, they're saying that they need $2 billion. In Jackson, Mississippi, they're saying they need $2 billion to renovate and modernize that system, right? Which is a significant amount of money. But in any kind of rational human-based system, we would have been provided that money way earlier to them, to be so that we're not doing it at a crisis moment like this.
Yeah.
Or two, like, it wouldn't even be an ask, in the sense of like, oh yeah, well, you need money to make sure that the people in your city have water. Here you go. We're going to do that at a federal level. I mean, these are opportunities to do real large scale work that will benefit people's lives and will put more money into the pockets of working people across the country, right? Like, the way to sell it is really easy. And we have to also make sure that when we're selling it, we're also pointing our fingers at the systems that make this a problem in the first place.